A man emerges from the shadows. No policeman dares stop him. No court dares try him. No enemy survives long enough to tell the tale. And she, a waitress with a bruised face, cracked lips, huddled in a bus station restroom at 2 a.m., calls that very number. A number she swore she would never dial again. Just one call. Just 4 whispered words in the darkness. And an entire criminal empire is set ablaze because of her. Like to support the channel and comment the name of the city you're watching. I want to know how far this story has come. Don't leave, because what's about to happen will leave you breathless. The rain had been falling for 6 hours straight by the time Kaelyn Voss walked through the emergency room doors for the 3rd time in 8 months. She walked slowly. Not because she was tired, though she was, bone-deep tired in the way that sleep couldn't fix anymore. She walked slowly because her left side hurt when she moved too fast, a dull grinding pressure beneath her ribs that flared white-hot if she twisted wrong. She kept her chin low. Her hair fell across her left cheekbone the way she'd arranged it in the gas station bathroom mirror 3 blocks away, carefully positioned to cover the worst of the swelling. The bruise had gone from red to deep purple in the hours since it happened. Foundation didn't touch it. She'd used half a travel-size compact, and the result was a smear of beige sitting on top of something the color of a rotting plum. The admissions nurse looked up. Her name tag said Reeves. She was maybe 50, with the kind of flat, careful expression that came from years of seeing things and deciding not to say anything about them. She recognized Kaelyn. That was immediately obvious from the slight pause before she reached for the intake form. A half-second hesitation that said everything without saying a word. "Name," she said. "Kaelyn Voss." She spelled the last name without being asked. "Date of birth." "March 4th. "And what brings you in tonight?" Kaelyn stared at a point just past the nurse's shoulder, a motivational poster on the wall. A cartoon sun above the words, "You are not alone." Someone had drawn a mustache on the sun with a ballpoint pen. "I fell," she said, "on the stairs." Nurse Reeves wrote something on the form. She didn't write "fell on the stairs." Kaelyn could tell by the angle of her wrist that she was writing something longer than that. They put her in bay 7, behind a curtain the color of old mustard. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with a frequency that sat right behind the eyes. A different nurse, younger, softer, clearly newer, took her blood pressure and winced at the reading without realizing she'd made a visible face. Kaelyn's blood pressure had been running high for months. Stress did that. Living the way she lived did that. She sat on the paper-covered examination table and stared at the curtain and listened to the ER around her. A child crying 2 bays over. A man with a deep voice explaining something in rapid Spanish. The squeak of rubber soles on tile. The distant percussion of the rain against the building's exterior. She did not cry. She hadn't cried since the 4th month. Somewhere around month 4, she'd run out of the immediate kind of tears. The ones that came from shock, from pain, from the specific humiliation of looking at yourself in a mirror and not recognizing what you'd become. Those tears had a bottom. She'd found it. What was left wasn't peace. It was just empty. The attending physician was a man in his late 30s with tired eyes and a stethoscope he kept forgetting to use. He examined the cheekbone, the ribs, the back of her left hand where the skin had been scraped across something rough. He said possible hairline fracture, not displaced. They'd X-ray to be certain. He said it in the careful, neutral voice that meant he also didn't believe the stares. Then he left, and someone else came in. He wasn't in scrubs. He was in plain clothes, dark jeans, a charcoal button-down with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, a jacket that had been expensive once and was now just worn. He was maybe mid-30s, lean in the way of someone who moved a lot rather than someone who lifted weights. He had a face that was all sharp geometry, jaw, cheekbones, the particular set of eyes that noticed things and stored them away quietly. He stood at the edge of her curtain without fully entering. "Ms. Voss." She looked at him. "I already told them I fell." "I know you did." He reached into his jacket pocket and held out a business card between 2 fingers. Didn't hand it to her, just held it out like an offering she could refuse. "My name is Detective Mercer Hale. I'm not here to take a report. I'm not here to pressure you into anything." Then why are you here? He set the card on the small table beside her bed, just placed it there and took his hand away. Third time in 8 months, he said without inflection. Same general injury pattern, different specific locations on the body, which suggests someone who varies the targets deliberately. That's not a person who loses control. That's a person who thinks about what they're doing. He paused. I'm here because I wanted you to have my number. That's all. Kaelyn looked at the card. She didn't pick it up. He'll kill me, she said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out flat, factual, like she was commenting on the weather. She heard it leave her mouth and didn't try to take it back. Detective Hale looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his expression. Not pity, which she would have hated, but something closer to recognition. The expression of a person who'd heard that sentence before and understood exactly how much weight it carried. I know, he said quietly, which is why I wanted you to have that. He left without another word. Kaelyn sat with the business card on the table beside her and the rain on the windows and the fluorescent buzz overhead for a long time after that. Then she picked up the card, held it between her fingers, and set it back down. She did not call the police. She never called the police. The bus station on Decker Avenue ran 24 hours, which meant it attracted the specific population of people who needed a place to be at 2 a.m. that wasn't home. Kaelyn was one of them. She'd gone back to the apartment while Derek was still passed out, the heavy, slack-faced unconsciousness that came after he'd been drinking. And she'd taken the duffel bag she kept behind the water heater. She'd been building it for 4 months. Change of clothes, $240 in small bills, her birth certificate in a Ziploc bag, a phone charger, 3 ibuprofen she'd been saving, a photograph she couldn't bring herself to throw away. She'd packed it the way a person packed for a disaster they knew was coming but couldn't predict the exact shape of. She sat in the women's restroom on the far end of the station and locked the stall door and sat on the closed toilet lid and shook. Her hands were the worst of it. They wouldn't stop. Not the violent shaking of acute shock, but a fine, persistent tremor she couldn't will away. She'd pressing her palms flat against her thighs, but she could still feel it. A vibration running up through her forearms that seemed to be coming from somewhere deeper than muscle. From somewhere inside the architecture of her, some structural thing that was cracking. She pressed her back against the stall wall and breathed through her nose until her ribs allowed it. She needed somewhere to go. The list of options was short. Her mother was 3 states away and they hadn't spoken in 2 years. The estrangement was one of the first things Derek had engineered, systematically, so gradually she hadn't noticed until the distance was already too great to easily cross. Her coworker Tessa from the diner had offered once back in the early months, but Derek had shown up at the diner twice in 1 week after that, and the look on Tessa's face when he walked in told Kaelyn everything she needed to know about putting other people in range of him. There was a women's shelter on the east side. She'd looked it up. She'd memorized the address, then deleted the search history. She'd walked past it once on a lunch break, stood on the opposite sidewalk, and stared at the plain door and the small sign and thought about going in. She hadn't gone in. She told herself she would. She didn't. So she sat in the bathroom stall and looked at her phone and felt the tremor in her hands and thought about all the places she couldn't go. Then she thought about the number. She'd had it for 2 years. She'd never deleted it despite everything, despite the fact that she'd left that world deliberately, despite the fact that keeping it felt like holding a grenade with the pin already pulled. It sat in her contacts under a false name, the name of a chain restaurant she'd once worked at in another city, so that even if Derek looked through her phone, he'd see nothing but what looked like a saved work number. She stared at the name for a long time. Her thumb moved before she'd made a conscious decision. The line rang once. Then silence. Not dead air, but the particular silence of a line that had connected to something, a presence without sound, someone listening. She said, "Can you come get me?" The voice that answered was low and unhurried. Not surprised, not warm exactly, but certain in a way that felt like a hand placed against something unsteady. "Tell me where you are." Her breath came apart at the seams. She told him. But Lucien Vale. The newspapers had a complicated relationship with his name. They used it carefully, the way you use the names of certain chemicals, accurately, but with an awareness of what happened if you got careless. They'd called him a myth, an urban legend, a ghost story that the city's criminal infrastructure told to keep itself disciplined. They'd published exactly 3 photographs of him in 15 years of trying, and in each one his face was obscured by angle, by distance, by the particular talent he had for existing in spaces without quite being visible. He was 41 years old. He ran a private equity firm with offices on the 32nd floor of a building downtown that appeared entirely legitimate from the outside. He also ran the operational structure that controlled 30% of the narcotics moving through Blackwater City's port, 4 of the city's most profitable underground gambling establishments, a protection network that covered roughly 60% of the city's major businesses, whether those businesses wanted it or not, and a system of informants woven into the police department and city government so thoroughly that the two had become nearly indistinguishable in places. Politicians attended his fundraisers. Judges played golf with his associates. 3 different federal investigations had approached him over the years and left without charges, which was either testament to his innocence or to the particular kind of insulation that money and careful organization provided. He was not a man who left the penthouse at 2:46 in the morning for anyone. Kaelyn heard them before she saw them. The low rumble of engines, the specific pitch of heavy vehicles moving in convoy formation, different from ordinary traffic. She was standing outside the station's main entrance with her duffel bag and the rain coming down on her when the first black SUV rounded the corner. There were 4 of them. They moved in a loose diamond formation, unhurried, taking up the street the way that things take up space when they don't need to justify their presence. 2 men got out of the lead vehicle before it fully stopped, moving quickly, automatically, scanning the street in both directions with the specific efficiency of people who'd been trained to treat every environment as a potential problem. They were wearing dark coats over clothing that didn't quite conceal the bulk of what was underneath. The station emptied almost immediately, not in a panicked way, more the way a space clears when a pressure system moves through, people finding reasons to be somewhere else without quite understanding why they were moving. The rear passenger door of the second vehicle opened. Lucien stepped out. She hadn't seen him in 2 years. He looked the same and different in the way that people looked after time. The core of him unchanged, but the surface slightly altered, the lines around his eyes a little deeper, the set of his jaw a little harder. He was wearing a dark wool coat over what looked like clothes he'd already been awake in, and his dark hair was damp at the temples from the brief exposure to the rain. He moved across the sidewalk without hurrying, the 2 men who'd gotten out first automatically adjusting their positions around him without any visible signal exchanged. He stopped 4 feet from her and looked at her face. Something moved through his expression. It was brief, and she almost missed it. A tightening around the eyes, a compression of the jaw so slight it could have been imagined. Then it was gone, replaced by the carefully neutral expression she remembered from the days when she'd worked for him. The face he wore in rooms where he needed to be unreadable. "I'm fine," she said, automatically. He looked at her for another second. His eyes moved to the cheekbone, the split lip she'd been pressing her tongue against all night, the way she was holding the duffel bag against her right side because reaching with her left arm pulled at something under her ribs. "I know you're not," he said. He held out his hand. She looked at it. She thought about Detective Hale's business card sitting on the table in Bay 7. She thought about the shelter on the east side with its plain door. She thought about the way Derek's face looked in the seconds before things got bad. The specific flatness that came over his eyes, like something switching off. She took Lucien's hand. The penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a building overlooking Blackwater Harbor, and it had the particular quality of spaces designed to make their security invisible. The walls of glass faced the water and the city skyline. The floors were pale stone. The furniture was expensive in an understated way, the kind of expensive that didn't announce itself but was present in the weight and texture of things. There were no obvious guards inside the residence itself, though Kaelyn understood that this didn't mean absence. It meant they were elsewhere, which was different. She stood in the main room and looked at the city through the glass wall and felt the distance from everything she'd left. The apartment, the diner, the bus station bathroom, and its flickering overhead light, as something almost physical, a pressure change, like surfacing. A woman named Petra brought her something to eat without being asked. Soup. Brown bread. The kind of food that was warm and uncomplicated. Kaelyn sat at the kitchen island and ate it in silence while Petra moved quietly in the background and pretended not to notice how much of it Kaelyn consumed, which was all of it. Lucien sat on the opposite side of the island with a glass of water he didn't drink. He watched her eat without speaking. She didn't look at him while she ate. Finally, when she'd set down the spoon and the bowl was empty, he said, "When did it start?" She looked at the bowl. "About 14 months ago." "Did you know what it was when it started?" She thought about that. "No, or—" She stopped. "I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know that what was wrong was the whole thing. I thought it was—" She shook her head. "It doesn't matter what I thought." "It does, actually." She looked at him. His face was still neutral, but there was something in his eyes, a quality of attention, of real listening, that she recognized from before. It was one of the things she'd noticed about him in those weeks at the Velvet Room, that when Lucien Vale was paying attention to you, he was fully paying attention to you, without the partial distraction or performance that characterized most people's listening. She'd found it unsettling then. She found it unsettling now. "I thought it was my fault," she said. "I thought if I was different somehow it would be different." He didn't tell her it wasn't her fault. He didn't say anything immediately. He just let her sentence sit in the air of the room without filling it with reassurance. She appreciated that more than she could explain. "His name is Derek Rayner," she said. "He runs drugs through the docks on the east side, small operation, but he has people." Lucien's expression didn't change. "He'll look for me," she said, "when he wakes up and I'm gone." "I know. I just need somewhere to be for a few days, until I can figure out—" "You're not staying for a few days," Lucien said. She looked at him. "I'm not?" "No." She felt something complicated move through her. Relief and discomfort in almost equal measure, the instinctive wariness of a person who'd learned to be cautious about rescue. "I don't need—" "Kaelyn." He said her name quietly, without force. Just said it. "Sleep. We'll discuss the rest tomorrow." She wanted to argue. She was too tired to argue. She slept in a room with a real door that locked from the inside, the key sitting on the nightstand where she could reach it without moving from the bed. She lay in the dark with the rain against the windows and felt the architecture of the silence around her. Deep, protected, the quiet of a fortified thing, and understood, somewhere below conscious thought, that she was safe. She didn't know yet what that safety would cost. 2 years earlier, Kaelyn had taken the waitress job at the Velvet Room because it paid double what the diner paid, and the tips, according to the woman who'd recruited her, were unreasonable. Both things were true. What the woman hadn't mentioned was that the Velvet Room's upper floors operated under a different set of rules than its public face, that the high roller tables in the back operated outside any regulatory framework, that the private rooms upstairs hosted meetings she wasn't supposed to know the content of, that the uniformed security staff had military backgrounds and didn't technically work for any registered company. She'd understood within the first week what kind of place it was. She'd stayed anyway. She needed the money. Lucien Vale ran the establishment from the shadows of it. He was present enough to be known, but absent enough to be deniable, appearing at odd hours, rarely at the gaming floor itself, but frequently in the back offices and the private areas, and always surrounded by the low-level hum of absolute authority that the staff responded to with the particular quality of deference given to things capable of serious harm. She'd given him coffee for the first time on a Tuesday night at 11 p.m., when she'd found him alone in the service corridor outside the main kitchen, leaning against the wall with his jacket off and his eyes closed, and the look of a man who hadn't slept in approximately 40 hours. She'd stood there with the tray and assessed the situation. Then she'd said, "You look terrible." He'd opened his eyes and looked at her with an expression of someone who genuinely hadn't expected that sentence. She'd held out the coffee. He'd taken it. That was how it started. For 6 weeks, she'd been a particular kind of invisible that happened to intersect with his schedule. She brought him coffee during the long nights when he was working through something complicated. She argued with him once, forcefully, when she found out from Petra that he'd been awake for over 50 hours. Not argued in the way of someone afraid to speak to him, but argued in the way of someone who found sustained self-destruction genuinely irritating. He'd looked at her through the argument with an expression she couldn't fully read. Then he'd eaten the food she'd put in front of him and the argument had ended. The shoulder happened in week 4. She'd been in the back office clearing the service tray when she heard voices go sharp in the adjacent room, a meeting that had evidently stopped being a meeting, and then the particular crash and disruption of a fight behind closed doors. She'd stood very still for about 15 seconds. Then 2 of Lucien's people had appeared through the door with the look of men managing a situation, and she'd seen the blood through the doorway. She went in. A man she didn't recognize was being removed through the other exit. Lucien was standing beside the desk with his jacket on the floor and blood soaking through the left shoulder of his shirt, the specific dark spread of a wound that was serious but not immediately catastrophic. 2 of his people were hovering with the anxious uselessness of men who were excellent at violence but had no framework for the aftermath of it. Kaelyn had said, "Someone get me the first aid kit and tell the other 2 to get out." Lucien had looked at her. "Now," she said, not to him but to the room. She'd stitched it. Her hands had been steady. She'd had a summer in her early 20s working for a traveling medical clinic that had taught her practical field skills that her formal life had never called for since. She'd worked in silence, and he'd sat still for it, watching her with an attention that might have been unsettling if she'd let herself notice it fully. When it was done, she'd said, "Who was that?" "Someone who thought he could renegotiate an agreement in person," Lucien said. "Did it work for him?" "No." She'd stood and gathered the kit. At the door, she'd paused. "You should eat something. Blood loss drops your glucose." She'd walked out. 2 weeks later, she'd given her notice at the Velvet Room. She'd taken a different job at a different diner and told herself it was because the hours were better. She hadn't thought about the truth of it too carefully. She hadn't thought about Lucien Vale for months after that. Not until Derek. Derek Rayner had charm the way certain kinds of weather had charm. Spectacular on first encounter, dangerous if you stayed in it too long. She'd met him at the diner 6 months after leaving the Velvet Room. He was good-looking in an uncomplicated way, broad-shouldered, easy smile, the kind of confidence that Rita's security. Before you understood, it was something else entirely. He'd asked for her number. She'd given it to him because nothing about him had triggered the particular awareness she'd developed for certain kinds of people. He didn't read as dangerous. That was the thing she'd think about later. The gap between how something presented and what it actually was. The failure of her own perception. The first incident happened 3 months in. She'd spent the night. She'd woken at 4 a.m. to find him standing at the foot of the bed in the dark, watching her, and she'd said his name, and something in his face had been wrong in a way she didn't have language for yet. He'd told her she'd been talking in her sleep. She'd believed him. The actual first incident happened 6 weeks later. After that, she'd begun to understand the shape of the thing she was in. She'd tried to leave 4 times. Each time, she'd learned more precisely what the word leave actually cost in his framework. He had a particular gift for identifying the specific dimensions of a person's world and making himself necessary to all of them, her job, her housing, the few connections she had in the city, so that by the time she fully understood she was trapped, she was genuinely trapped. The logistics of it. That was the thing that people who hadn't been in it rarely understood. It wasn't only fear that kept a person in place, it was logistics. The architecture of dependency that got built around you while you weren't paying attention. Now she lay in Lucien's safest room and stared at the ceiling and ran through the variables. Derek would wake up. Derek would find her gone. Derek would understand that the level of preparation required for what she'd done. The packed bag, the cash, the phone she'd bought under a fake name 3 months ago, meant she'd been planning, which would feel to him like a betrayal compounded by deception, which would drive him to a specific and predictable kind of extreme. He would look for her. He would not stop looking. She pressed her palms flat against the bedsheet and felt the tremor, still there, finer now, like something settling. She did not know, lying there in the dark, that Derek's search would eventually reach a different kind of conclusion than either of them anticipated. She did not know that in approximately 36 hours, Derek Rayner would make the single worst decision of his life. He would send Lucien Vale a message, and everything would accelerate toward something none of them could stop. Morning came gray and wet, the city still soaked from the night before. Kaelyn woke before 6. She lay still for a moment, listening to the rain, orienting herself through the unfamiliar quality of the silence. The particular quiet of a place with thick walls and serious security, different from the apartment's thin walls and the constant ambient sound of a building that couldn't afford to be properly insulated. She found Lucien in the kitchen. He was standing at the counter reading something on a tablet, a cup of coffee in his other hand. He was wearing a different shirt than the night before. The rest of him looked like he hadn't slept. She stood in the doorway. He looked up. "Coffee's made." She poured a cup. "He's already started looking," Lucien said, not raising his voice, not looking up from the tablet, just saying it. She set down the coffee cup. "How do you know?" "Because I have someone who monitors certain channels." She thought about what that meant, the infrastructure required to monitor Derek's channels, to already know by morning. She thought about the size of the machinery that had arrived at the bus station last night. "What did he do?" she asked. Lucien set down the tablet. He looked at her with the full attention again. "He contacted 2 of his suppliers before sunrise, asking them to put word out. He also went to the diner." He paused. "He told your co-worker Tessa that you were unstable, that you'd stolen from him, and he was worried about you." Kaelyn felt it land. Not surprise. She'd known he'd go to Tessa, had known what shape that conversation would take. It was the particular exhaustion of being correctly predicted by someone who wanted to destroy you. "Is Tessa okay?" Something moved through Lucien's expression. It was brief. "She's fine." Kaelyn wrapped her hands around the coffee cup and looked out at the harbor. The water was dark and choppy, white-capped in the wind. A container ship moved slowly through the distance, indifferent. "He's going to escalate," she said. "Yes. When he can't find me, he's going to—" She stopped. She was going to say, "do something terrible," but the words were insufficient and also obvious. She pressed her lips together. "He doesn't respond to not getting what he wants." "I know what he is," Lucien said. She looked at him. "Do you?" Derek Rayner, 29 years old, runs a distribution operation out of a warehouse on Pier 17 for a supplier named Costas Venn. Small operation by volume, but reliable, which is why Venn keeps him. 2 prior arrests, no convictions. The second arrest was domestic. The case was dropped. She stared at him. "I looked into you before I came last night," he said. Simply. Like that was a normal thing. She should have found that unsettling. She found it, instead, something she didn't have a clean word for. The complicated feeling of being known by someone powerful who had chosen to come anyway. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Lucien picked up his tablet again. He looked at the screen for a moment. "Handle it." "That's not an answer." He looked up. "I need to know what handle it means," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not entirely. She pressed them flat against the counter. "I need to know because I'm the one sitting in the middle of it, and I don't—" She stopped. She started again. "I don't want anyone—" "Kaelyn." She stopped. "Let me manage this," he said quietly. "That's all I'm asking." She looked at him for a long moment. In that moment, she was aware of all the things she didn't know about what happened inside the machinery of Lucien Vale's world. The things that happened in adjacent rooms behind closed doors. The gap between what a person presented and what they actually were. She'd thought that thought before, about someone else. And look how that had ended. She picked up her coffee cup. "Okay," she said. She wasn't sure yet if she meant it. What she was sure of was this. Somewhere on the other side of the city, Derek Rayner was awake and angry and beginning to understand that he'd been left. And in his particular psychological architecture, there was only one direction that realization traveled. Toward her. Always toward her. She drank her coffee and watched the harbor and felt the tremor in her hands finally begin to still, just slightly, just the smallest fraction. And somewhere in the back of her mind, beneath the exhaustion and the fear and the complicated weight of being here in this place with this man, a different kind of awareness was beginning to form. Something was coming. She didn't know yet that Derek was already making calls he shouldn't have been making, calls that reached past his own level, into the territory of a rival organization that had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. She didn't know that by reaching out to those people, Derek had just handed them something they'd been looking for years, a direct line to Lucien Vale's one visible vulnerability. Her. 3 days passed. They passed in the particular slow-motion quality of a held breath, each hour edged with the awareness of something building outside the penthouse walls, the way you felt a storm in the barometric pressure before you could see it in the sky. Kaelyn moved through Lucien's space carefully, the way you move through someone else's world when you weren't sure yet of the rules, keeping her footprint small, staying close to the walls. She explored the penthouse the way she explored everything unfamiliar, systematically, without making a show of it. The main floor was living space. The glass wall, the kitchen, a long dining table that looked like it hadn't been used for its actual purpose in years. The second floor was offices and private rooms she didn't enter. There was a gym she used at 5 in the morning when no one else was awake, running on the treadmill until the tremor in her hands went away and the inside of her head went quiet. There was the rooftop, accessible through a steel door with a keypad that Lucien had shown her the code for on the second morning without explanation. She went up there when the rain cleared, which wasn't often. She did not see Lucien frequently. He moved through the space on a schedule she couldn't map, present at certain hours, absent at others, occasionally arriving in the early morning with the specific tension of someone coming from something difficult that he had no intention of discussing. He ate when Petra put food in front of him. He slept less than anyone she'd ever known. When they were in the same room, the air had a particular quality, dense, charged in the way of spaces where something significant was being carefully not said. He checked on her. Not intrusively. It was more like a recurring inventory, the way you checked on something you'd taken responsibility for. A brief appearance in whatever room she was in, a question about whether she needed anything, a look that took in the state of her and registered the answer without asking it directly. She found it alternately reassuring and irritating in a ratio that shifted depending on how much sleep she'd gotten. On the morning of the 4th day, Petra came to find her. Petra Voss, no relation, Kaelyn had established immediately, with the particular reflexive speed of someone who'd spent years managing her surname's associations, was 62 years old and had been running Lucien's household since before Kaelyn was born. She was compact and gray-haired and had the precise efficiency of someone who'd survived decades in proximity to serious power by being indispensable and invisible in equal measure. She did not explain things she didn't think required explanation. She did not discuss her employer. She came to the kitchen where Kaelyn was sitting with coffee and the view and said, "There's a situation. He wants you to stay on this floor until he tells you otherwise." Kaelyn looked up. "What situation?" "He'll explain when he can." "Can you give me a general?" "I can't." Petra's expression wasn't unkind. "Please stay on this floor." She left. Kaelyn sat with her coffee for approximately 4 minutes. Then she went to find Lucien. He was on the second floor in the room he used as a primary office. She'd cataloged it through the open door on her second day, 3 screens on a standing desk, a whiteboard covered in notations she hadn't been close enough to read, windows that faced the city rather than the harbor. The door was half open. She pushed it the rest of the way. There were 2 other men in the room. She recognized one of them, Callum, tall and blonde with a scar running through his left eyebrow, who functioned as something between chief of security and chief of staff and never spoke to her directly. The other man she didn't recognize. He was older, heavy-set, with the face of someone who'd been delivering bad news professionally for years and had made his peace with it. All 3 of them looked at her when she came in. Lucien's jaw tightened by a fraction. "Petra told me to stay downstairs," Kaelyn said. "I know." "I'm not doing that." A beat of silence. The unrecognized man looked at Callum. Callum looked at the wall. Lucien looked at Kaelyn with the particular expression of someone reassessing a variable. "Give us a minute," he said to the room. The 2 men left. Callum pulled the door mostly closed behind him. Lucien turned back to the screens. He stood with his arms crossed and his back partially to her, looking at something on the center display that she couldn't see the content of from where she stood. His shoulders were set in the specific way of someone managing something they hadn't expected. "What happened?" she said. "Derek made contact with Costas Venn yesterday morning." He said it to the screen, then turned to face her. "Not normal business contact. He went to Venn with information." "What information?" "Information about my operation. specifically about routes and schedules that would be useful to someone looking for a vulnerability. He paused. In exchange for protection and a sum of money, Derek gave Ven's organization a blueprint for accessing certain logistical gaps in how I move things in and out of the harbor. The room felt slightly smaller than it had a moment ago. "He sold you out," she said. "He sold what he thought was useful. A small-time runner on Pier 17 doesn't have access to anything genuinely sensitive about my operation, but he had enough peripheral observation over enough time to construct something that looked credible. And Ven? Ven's been looking for an angle on me for 4 years. He said it matter-of-factly, without heat. He has the resources to weaponize even partial information. The question isn't whether Derek's data is accurate. The question is whether Ven believes it is." Kaelyn stood very still. She was processing the specific shape of what she'd caused, not by intention, not by action, but by existence, by being the person that Derek would sacrifice anything to find, including the safety of whatever information proximity to her world had given him. "This is because of me," she said. "This is because of Derek." "Lucien, do not do that," he said. His voice was quiet and completely level. "Do not take the architecture of someone else's choices and build yourself a room inside it." She looked at him. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned back to the screens. "Ven will move on the information within the week. We have time to address it." "Address it how?" He didn't answer immediately. He pulled up something on the left screen. A map of the harbor district, she thought, with overlays she couldn't interpret from the distance. "The routes get changed tonight," he said. "Certain personnel get relocated. There are 2 people in my organization who were positioned to be visible to Derek in ways that created his access to that information. Those positions get restructured." She heard the careful neutrality in that last sentence, heard what it didn't say. "What does restructured mean?" she asked. He looked at her. She held his gaze. "I need you to tell me what that means." A pause. He uncrossed his arms. "It means they move to different roles with different visibility. Nothing permanent." He said it without looking away, and she understood that he understood what she was actually asking, and that he was choosing to give her the honest answer. She let out a breath. "And Derek?" she said. His expression shifted very slightly. Just the eyes. "Derek is a separate matter." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have right now." She wanted to push. She could feel the shape of what she wanted to say sitting at the back of her throat. Something about limits, about what she could and couldn't be inside of, about the difference between protection and something else. But she looked at his face and saw the actual weight in it. Not the criminal architect running calculations, but something underneath that, something tired and careful and more complicated. And she held the words back. "Okay," she said. She left the office and went back downstairs and stood at the glass wall and looked at the harbor for a long time with her arms wrapped around herself, feeling the particular cold of a decision she hadn't technically made yet, but that was already shaping itself around her like weather. Tessa called that afternoon. Kaelyn saw the name on the burner phone screen and felt her stomach drop 3 floors. She answered. "He came back," Tessa said. No preamble. Her voice had a tight, controlled quality that meant she was trying very hard to sound like she wasn't scared. "Last night, after close, he was waiting in the parking lot." "Tessa, I'm okay. I just..." A breath. "He asked me where you were. I said I didn't know. He said he didn't believe me. He said..." She stopped. "What did he say?" "He said you were sick, that you'd done something, that whoever was hiding you was going to find out who they were dealing with." Kaelyn pressed the phone hard against her ear and stared at the floor. "He said it like he meant it about a specific person," Tessa said. "Like he wasn't just talking about me." "He doesn't know where I am." "Kaelyn, he had someone with him. Not one of his usual, I know his usual people. This guy was different, older. He stayed in the car, but I saw him." "What did he look like?" "Big, gray hair, cut short. He had a tattoo on his neck. I couldn't see it clearly, but it looked like..." She paused. "I don't know. It looked like a company logo almost. A circle with something inside it. Kaelyn carried that description upstairs without running, though her body wanted to run. Oop. Callum identified the tattoo from her description in under 4 minutes, which told her the description was familiar. He and Lucien exchanged a look over her head that she wasn't supposed to see and absolutely saw. "Tell me," she said. Lucien sat down. He sat in the chair behind his desk the way he sat when he was deciding how much to say. Leaning slightly forward, forearms on the desk, a stillness that was different from relaxation. It was the stillness of something that had stopped moving in order to be more precise. "The tattoo is a marker used by Ven's senior operational people," he said, meaning Derek isn't just working with Ven's organization. He's been elevated enough that they're sending senior personnel to assist him. The room was very quiet. "Why would they do that?" Kaelyn asked. She heard her own voice come out flat and clear, which surprised her because her chest felt like someone was standing on it. "Because Derek gave them something worth senior personnel," Lucien said. "Or he promised them something." He paused. "Or both." She sat down on the edge of the chair facing the desk without being invited to. Her legs had made the decision before her mind caught up. "They're not looking for me to return me to Derek," she said. "No. They're looking for me because I'm—" She stopped. The sentence completed itself in her head without her permission. "Because I'm the thing that gets you to come out from behind your walls." "They're going to use me." Lucien looked at her. His face was doing the unreadable thing again, but behind it, she was getting better at reading what was behind it. Something was working very hard. "You're going to tell me I should leave," she said. "That being here is what makes me a target, and if I go somewhere else, they lose their angle." "You should leave," he said. "Where?" He was quiet. "Where would I go that Ven's organization couldn't find, Lucien? I don't have your infrastructure. I don't have—" She pressed her hands flat on her thighs. The tremor was back. She hated it. "If I go to a shelter, they find me in a week. If I leave the city, I have $240 and a fake phone. There's nowhere I can go where I'm harder to get to than here." He stared at the desk surface for a moment. "I know," he said. "So don't tell me to leave." "I know," he said again, differently. She looked at him. The weight of the silence between them had a different texture than usual. It wasn't the careful not saying of people managing an undefined proximity. It was something more direct than that. Two people sitting in the shape of a problem that had no clean solution and acknowledging it without performance. "I'm sorry," she said. He looked up sharply. "I called you," she said. "I made this happen." "Kaelyn, I know what you're going to say, but it's still true that I called you, and this is the result, and I need to say it." She held his gaze. "I'm sorry it landed on you." He looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his face. Not the surface of it, but the thing underneath, the thing she caught in glimpses and couldn't quite name. His jaw moved slightly, the way it did when he was deciding whether to say something. "You stitched my shoulder in that office without being asked," he said finally. "You argued with me about eating. You treated me like a person in a building full of people who treated me like something else." He paused. "You don't owe me an apology for calling." She looked at the desk. "I kept your number," she said. "I know. For 2 years. I know that too." The silence between them this time was different from all the other silences. She was aware of his hands on the desk, the particular quality of his stillness, the distance between where she was sitting and where he was sitting, and the fact that it was not a large distance. She stood up before the moment could become something she didn't have the structural integrity for right now. "Okay," she said. "What do we do?" He stood too, back to the screens, back to the maps and the calculations. The professional distance reasserting itself with the efficiency of a man who'd had a lot of practice at it. "We let them look," he said, "and we prepare for what happens when they find what they're actually looking for." She didn't ask what that meant. She understood what that meant. She went downstairs. That evening, Lucien came to the kitchen while she was making tea, which she was doing because her hands needed something to do, and there was nothing else available. He came in without announcing himself and stood at the counter and watched her for a moment. "Tell me something," he said. She looked at him. When you left the velvet room, why did you actually leave? She turned back to the kettle. The water was just beginning to sound. The job paid well, she said. The environment was... She stopped. It was a lot. That's not why. She poured the water. Steam rose. She watched it dissipate. No, she said. It's not. She turned around and leaned against the counter with the mug and looked at him across the kitchen. He was standing with his arms loose at his sides, which was unusual for him. He generally held his body with more deliberate containment than that. You were too much, she said. Not in a bad way, just... She felt for the words. I was working there because I needed money. I was going to work there for 6 months and leave, and that was the whole plan. And then... She shook her head slightly. You complicated the plan. He was very still. That's why I left, she said, because staying felt like making a different kind of choice than I was ready to make. He looked at her for a long moment. And now, he said. She held the mug and felt the heat of it against her palms and looked at him across the kitchen. Now I'm standing in your kitchen at 9 p.m. in borrowed clothes hiding from my abusive ex-boyfriend who's apparently entered into a strategic partnership with a mid-level crime syndicate, she said. So the choice seems to have gotten made without me. Something moved across his face. It was close to a smile. Not quite. I've missed you, he said. Straightforward, with no architecture around it. She looked at her tea. Don't do that, she said quietly. Why? Because I can't. She stopped. She pressed her lips together. I can't have things feel complicated right now. I need things to be clear. I need to be able to think. He nodded. Once, slow. He understood the distinction. Okay, he said. He left the kitchen. She stood with her tea and the steam and the harbor visible through the dark glass, and felt something ache in her chest that she refused to examine too closely. The attack happened on a Thursday. Lucien had a prior commitment, a charity event, genuinely legitimate, the kind of public appearance that maintained the surface of his legitimate business life, that he hadn't canceled because canceling it would signal awareness of Ven's move, and signaling awareness would accelerate a timeline he was still preparing for. He'd told Kaelyn she'd be staying at the penthouse. She'd agreed. She'd meant it. What changed was the call from Tessa at 7:15, 40 minutes before Lucien was scheduled to leave. Tessa's voice stripped down to barely functional, breath coming wrong, saying that 2 men were at her apartment building and she was locked in her bathroom and she didn't know what to do. Kaelyn had said, "Don't open the door. Call 911. Right now, Tessa." "I did," Tessa said. "They're not here yet." "Stay on the phone with them." "Kaelyn, they have a photo of you. I saw it through the peephole when they showed the landlord. They're looking for you." She'd hung up and gone to find Lucien. He was in his bedroom getting ready for the event, tie half knotted, jacket on the bed. He looked at her face when she came through the door and stopped what he was doing. She told him. He was on the phone within 30 seconds, terse instructions she could only partially follow, redirecting 2 personnel to Tessa's building. Then he looked at Kaelyn. "You're staying here. Tessa is being handled." He held her gaze. "You stay here." She held his gaze back. "She's there because of me. Everything right now is because of Derek's choices and Ven's agenda, not yours." He picked up the jacket. His movements were quick and precise, the movements of someone shifting operational modes. "Callum will be on this floor. 2 others on the building perimeter. You stay inside. You stay away from the windows. You answer your phone if I call." She wanted to argue. The argument died in her throat because he was right and she knew it. He shrugged on the jacket. He stopped at the door. "I'll be 2 hours, he said. "Okay." He left. She stood in the middle of his bedroom. The unfamiliar intimacy of that, standing in the space of him, the made bed and the dark wood furniture and the faint smell of whatever he used, and breathed. Callum appeared in the hallway. "Miss Voss, this floor, please." She went back downstairs. An hour into the event, Lucien's convoy was on the bridge. She knew this because Callum took a call that made the muscles in his neck go tight, and that was enough. She crossed the room to him before he could manage his expression into something controlled. What happened? He put his hand over the phone. Ms. Voss. Callum. What happened? He looked at her. He made a decision. Ambush on the Carver Street Bridge, he said. Gunfire. The floor felt slightly uncertain under her feet. Is he... I don't have confirmation of status yet. He was back on the phone before she could speak again, rapid and low, navigating something she wasn't part of. She stood in the middle of Lucien's living room with the harbor black and rain-blurred beyond the glass wall, and felt something happen in her chest that she hadn't been prepared for. Not the abstract fear of a person in a dangerous situation, but the specific, localized, terrifying fear of someone who had let something matter to them. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. She stood there and waited. 11 minutes later, her phone rang. She answered before the first ring finished. Lucien's voice, rough at the edges, slightly compressed, the voice of someone in motion, dealing with something physical, managing pain or adrenaline or both. I'm upright, he said. She closed her eyes. The convoy was hit, he said. We're off the bridge. 2 of my people took injuries. A pause. And in the pause she heard something beneath the operational report. Something he was deciding whether to say. Kaelyn. I'm here. It wasn't random. Another pause. She heard the sound of him moving, a door, a change in background noise. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. They knew the route. They knew the timing. Another beat. Derek didn't just give Ven information about the harbor operation. He gave them tonight's schedule. She was very still. Someone got that information to him recently, Lucien said, within the last 48 hours, which means someone inside my organization is still in contact with Derek or with Ven's people. The implications assembled themselves in her mind with a clarity that felt like cold water. There's a leak, she said. Yes. Someone who knew about tonight. Someone who knew about tonight and about the route. He paused. And about you. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. Lucien! Stay exactly where you are, he said. His voice had dropped to something very quiet and very precise. Don't open the door for anyone except Callum. If Callum leaves that floor, you go to the second stairwell and you call me directly. What are you? I'm 20 minutes out. Don't move. The line went dead. She stood in the living room with the dead phone in her hand and the rain against the glass, and the city spread below her in all its cold indifference, and thought about what he'd just said. Someone who knew about you. Inside his organization, which meant that the place she'd believed was the safest she could be. The sound behind her was very small, just the faint change in air pressure of a door that had been opened somewhere it shouldn't have been. She turned around slowly. Callum was not in the room. Callum had been in the room 30 seconds ago. The hallway leading to the secondary entrance was dark, in a way it hadn't been dark before. The motion sensor light that activated automatically the motion sensor light in the hallway was dark. Kaelyn stood in the center of the living room with the dead phone in her hand and looked at that darkness and felt her body understand something before her mind caught up. A primal recalibration, every system shifting simultaneously, the hair on her arms rising in the cold air that was coming from a direction it hadn't been coming from 30 seconds ago. She did not call out. She did not move toward the hallway. She moved sideways, slowly, toward the kitchen island, keeping her body low and her back to the glass wall where the city lights behind her would make her a silhouette, which was bad, but the kitchen island was cover, which was better. She moved the way she'd learned to move in the apartment, without sound, without sharp corners, making herself small and predictable to no one. She pressed her back against the kitchen island and breathed through her nose. The secondary entrance was a service corridor that came up from the building's freight elevator. She'd cataloged it on day 2, noted that it required a key card that only building staff possessed, noted the motion sensor, filed it as a structural fact without fully applying its implications. She was applying them now. Callum had been standing 6 feet from the hallway entrance 30 seconds ago. He was not standing there now. She reached behind her without looking, and her hand found the knife block on the counter, and her fingers wrapped around the handle of the largest knife in it. A chef's knife, heavy, balance point toward the blade, and she pulled it free without sound. She held it at her side, and she waited, and she breathed. Footsteps, single set, moving with the careful placement of someone trying to be quiet, which told her several things. One person, not rushing, not certain of her location. Hunting. Then a voice from the hallway, and her stomach dropped. "Miss Voss?" Callum. His voice had the same flat quality it always had. No elevation, no stress markers. She held the knife and did not answer and tried to reconcile what she was hearing with what she was feeling, which was that something was profoundly wrong. "I know you're in there," he said, still from the hallway, not advancing yet. "Put down whatever you picked up. I'm not going to hurt you." She said nothing. "Lucien is on his way. He wants you relocated. The penthouse has been compromised." She pressed her spine harder against the cabinet and thought about that sentence. Relocated. The specific word choice of it, not moved or taken somewhere safer. Relocated. "Why is the hall light off?" she said. A pause. Half a beat too long. "Motion sensor's been glitching," he said. "For 2 days. Lucien knows about it." She thought about whether that was true. She thought about whether she had any way to verify it. She thought about Lucien's voice on the phone 11 minutes ago. "Don't open the door for anyone except Callum." And she thought about the fact that Lucien had also said someone inside my organization. "Call Lucien," she said, "right now. Put him on speaker." Another pause. "He's managing the situation on the bridge. I can't—" "Call him," she said, "or I stay behind this counter until he walks through the front door himself." Silence. She heard him shift his weight in the hallway, the small sound of a person making a decision. Then he came around the corner. He was alone. He was in his usual clothes, dark jacket, the wire of an earpiece just visible. His hands were visible and empty. His face was the same calibrated neutral it always was, the face of a man who'd made a career of giving nothing away. But his eyes were doing something she'd never seen them do before. They were moving. Quick, micro movements, taking inventory of the room, the windows, the exits, her position, with the systematic efficiency of a man running tactical calculations. Not the eyes of someone reassuring, the eyes of someone assessing. She kept the knife at her side. "Where are you taking me?" she said. "Somewhere safer than here." "Where?" "A secondary location. Lucien told me not to move unless he called me directly." She watched his face. "He called me 7 minutes ago. He said he was 20 minutes out. He said to stay exactly where I was." Callum looked at her. The calibration shifted. It was subtle. The kind of shift that only happened in faces that were almost perfectly controlled, the last 2% giving way. Something behind his eyes changed quality, the performance of reassurance dropping away like a coat sliding off a hook. And what was underneath it was not hostile exactly, but it was cold and it was decided, and it was the expression of a person who had already done the math on this situation and arrived at an answer she was not going to like. "Put the knife down," he said. "No," she said. "Kaelyn, tell me who's waiting downstairs." His jaw moved. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him calculating, running scenarios, deciding how much of the truth served his current objective. "Ven's people sent a team," he said finally, "to the building. They came up the freight corridor." He said it without inflection, without apology, like he was reading a weather report. "I'm taking you down before Lucien gets here. You go quietly. Nobody in this building gets hurt." The room made a sound that she realized after a moment was her own breath. "You," she said. "Ms. Voss. You're the leak." She heard her own voice come out strange. Not loud, not breaking, but stripped of everything except the bare mechanical function of speech. "You've been in contact with Ven." He looked at her with the flat patience of a man who didn't see the point of the conversation, but was willing to let it run its course. "How long?" she said. "Long enough." "Did you give them the route tonight, the bridge?" Something moved through his face. The first actual emotion she'd seen there. Not guilt, but something adjacent to discomfort. "That wasn't supposed to go the way it went." "People got shot, Callum. I know that." "Lucien's people." "I know what happened." His voice tightened fractionally. "It wasn't supposed to be a hit. It was supposed to be a demonstration. Ven wanted Lucien distracted while the team came up here. That's all it was supposed to be. She looked at him and understood, with a terrible clarity, that he believed that distinction mattered. That in whatever negotiation he'd constructed in his own mind between loyalty and self-interest, the line he'd told himself he wasn't crossing was a line he'd in fact already obliterated. "You've worked for him for 11 years, she said. "I know how long I've worked for him." "Then why?" "Because Ven offered me something Lucien never will." He said it without heat, like he'd already processed the emotion out of it long ago, worn the feeling down to a smooth fact he could carry without discomfort. A clean exit, money enough to disappear. All I had to give him was access. "Access," she repeated, "to me." He looked at her directly, to a leverage point. She held the knife and looked at him and felt something go very cold and very quiet inside her. Not panic. She'd been past panic for the last 3 minutes. What replaced panic, she was discovering, was a particular quality of attention. The kind that happened when a person's system stripped everything non-essential away and left only the immediate geometry of survival. The knife was 12 inches of carbon steel. She knew how to use a kitchen knife in ways that were practical rather than violent. She'd worked in restaurant kitchens for a combined 6 years. She knew the weight of it, the extension of it, the difference between holding it correctly and holding it in the way that well-meaning people in movies held knives, which would get you hurt. Callum was 6'1" and had military training and was standing 8 feet away. Those were the facts. "Tell me one thing," she said. "Is Lucien actually 20 minutes out?" Callum's expression changed again. The smallest softening, not kindness, but something that might have been respect for the directness of the question. "Yes," he said. "He's actually coming. And if I go with you now, you're leverage, not a casualty. Ven needs you functional to make Lucien negotiate. That's the whole mechanics of it." "And when the negotiation ends?" He didn't answer. She looked at his face and understood that the silence was its own answer and that she had approximately 30 seconds before he stopped allowing the conversation to continue. She threw the knife, not at him. She threw it past him, hard, at the glass panel beside the main entrance, and it hit with a sound like a small explosion, a crack that spread from the impact point in a starburst fracture, and Callum's head turned toward the sound for 1/2 second from pure reflex. She ran. Not at him, and not away from him, but past the kitchen island toward the second stairwell door, the one Lucien had pointed out on her second day, the one on the far side of the dining room behind the decorative panel that looked like a wall. She hit the panel at full speed with her shoulder and felt it give, and then she was through it, and the door was steel, and she pulled it open and went through, and then she was running downstairs, 2 at a time, the metal ringing under her feet, her hand dragging on the railing for balance. She could hear him behind her. Not close. 5, 6 seconds of head start. But he knew the building, and she only knew what she'd mapped in 4 days of careful looking. She hit the landing for floor 31 and kept going. 30, 29. She was breathing hard through her mouth, her ribs sending bright flares of protest with every landing impact, the hairline fracture the ER doctor had mentioned making itself known with pointed efficiency. She went through the door at the 28th floor because going all the way to the ground meant walking into whatever Ven had waiting in the lobby, and she needed a phone, and she needed somewhere to be that was not a stairwell with one entrance. The 28th floor was office space, dark, the kind of corporate dark that was absolute after hours. No ambient light except the emergency exit signs and the city glow coming through the exterior windows. She ran to the nearest window and pressed herself against the wall beside it and looked out at the angles she could see. 2 black vehicles on the street below. Not Lucien's configuration. She'd memorized Lucien's configuration. She pressed her back against the wall and breathed. Her phone. She still had her phone in her hand. She'd been holding it when she ran, hadn't let go of it. She looked at the screen. 3 missed calls from Lucien in the last 4 minutes. She called him back. He answered on the first ring. "Where are you?" Not a question. The compressed, stripped voice of a man moving. 28th floor, East Wing office space. She was whispering. "Callum is Ven's contact. He's in the stairwell." Silence that lasted 1 full second. "Say that again." "Callum, he's the leak. He tried to take me down to a team in the lobby." She was watching the stairwell door across the dark office. Lucien, there are two vehicles outside that aren't yours. She heard him speak to someone else. Low, rapid, entirely controlled. And then he was back. Do not move from that floor. I'm 6 minutes out. I'm sending 2 people up the north stairwell right now. A pause. Kaelyn, I'm here. You're okay. She looked at the stairwell door. It hadn't moved. Ask me again in 6 minutes, she said. Lucien arrived in 4. She heard him before she saw him. The sound of the stairwell door opening with force, the low exchange of voices, the specific weight of his footstep that she'd apparently memorized without intending to. He came through the door with 2 of his people flanking, and he moved through the dark office toward her with the directional certainty of someone who'd been given her exact position. And he stopped in front of her and looked at her face, and then he looked at the rest of her with the same comprehensive inventory she'd seen him do twice before. Ribs, she said, before he asked, and I'm fine. He put one hand on the side of her face, not romantic, clinical, tilting her face toward the emergency light to look at her eyes, checking for shock. His hand was cold, and there was dried blood on his knuckles that she didn't ask about yet. He looked at her for a moment, then he took his hand away and turned to the taller of his 2 people. Find Callum, he said. Quiet. The particular quiet of something that had moved past anger into a register below it. Bring him to the secondary office. Don't let anyone else touch him. The man left. Lucien stood in the dark with her and the city light coming through the windows and said nothing for a moment. He was doing the thing where he was processing something enormous, with absolute surface stillness, like a pressure vessel containing something at high temperature. 11 years, he said finally. I know. He was at my father's burial. He said it to the window, flat. He helped me build the operational structure from the ground up. She didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say. He turned from the window. Let's go, he said. Callum was in the secondary office on the 35th floor, a room she hadn't seen before, stripped down, a table and chairs and nothing on the walls, and the particular quality of a space designed for conversations that didn't leave it. 2 of Lucien's people stood at the door. Callum sat in the chair at the table, with his hands visible and his face arranged in the same neutral expression as always, which under the circumstances was either impressive or monstrous. Lucien sat across from him. Kaelyn stood against the wall. Lucien looked at Callum for a long time without speaking. Callum met his gaze. Tell me the shape of it, Lucien said. Callum looked at the table surface. Something shifted in his expression. The first genuine thing she'd seen from him all night. A kind of fatigue that went deep. 14 months, he said. Ven approached me through an intermediary. He stopped, started again. I was in a position I couldn't get out of alone. Money. A situation with a former associate that had gotten complicated. He said it without asking for sympathy and got none. Ven offered to resolve it in exchange for access. Access meaning what specifically? Schedules, routes, personnel movements. He paused. Nothing structural. I didn't give him the operational framework. I drew a line. You drew a line, Lucien said. Something in his voice made the room feel smaller. I drew a line and Ven moved it 3 times, Callum said. That's how it works. You give a small thing and then the thing grows, and by the time you understand the size of it, you're already past the point where you can… He stopped. The bridge tonight, Lucien said. Callum's jaw tightened. I gave them the route. I was told it was for positioning, for putting pressure on you to negotiate. I was not told there would be a weapons team. But you gave the route. Silence. Ramos took 2 rounds, Lucien said. He's in surgery right now. The color shifted slightly in Callum's face. And you tried to take her, Lucien said. That was the arrangement. She goes to Ven as leverage. You negotiate. She comes back unharmed when you come to terms. He said it with the careful precision of a person reciting an agreement that had seemed reasonable at one point and now sounded like something else entirely. Nobody was supposed to get hurt. Ramos is in surgery, Lucien said again. Callum looked at the table. Lucien sat in perfect stillness for a long moment. His hands were on the table, flat, the dried blood still on his right knuckles, and she watched his face and saw something happening behind it that was enormous and contained, and she understood that what she was watching was a man deciding what kind of person he was going to be in the next 30 seconds. He looked at Callum for a very long time. "Where's Ven's team now?" he said. "They pulled back when you arrived. Standard protocol. If extraction isn't clean in the window, abort and reassemble." "Where do they reassemble?" Callum looked at him. "Where?" Lucien said. The same quiet. The register that had moved below anger. Callum gave him an address on the south side. Slowly, precisely. Like a man paying a debt he'd been accumulating for a long time. Lucien stood. He looked down at Callum for a moment. Then he looked at the two men at the door and gave an instruction she couldn't fully hear, and then he looked at Kaelyn and said, "Come with me." She followed him out of the room. In the corridor, she said, "What are you going to do with him?" Lucien walked. She walked beside him. "Handle it," he said. She stopped walking. He took 2 more steps before he noticed and stopped and turned. She looked at him. "Lucien." "Kaelyn." "He was going to hand me to Ven," she said. "I know that. I was there." She held his gaze. "But he told you where they are. He gave you what you asked for." Lucien looked at her. His face was doing the unreadable thing with something different underneath it now. Not the careful containment of the penthouse, but the raw-edged exhaustion of a person who had just discovered that something they'd built their trust on for over a decade was hollow. "He put you in a position where you were alone in a dark building with people coming up through the freight elevator," he said. "I know." "He gave Ven's people the route that put Ramos in an operating room." "I know that too." She pressed her hands flat against her thighs, the gesture she'd developed for the tremor, and held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to forgive him. I'm not asking you to keep him close to you. I'm asking you what handle it actually means." He looked at her for a long moment. "I don't know yet," he said. She believed him. She started walking again. The South Side address was a warehouse on the industrial border of the Harbor District. Not one of Lucien's, one of Ven's. A location Callum had been feeding information from and about in both directions for 14 months, like a man standing in 2 streams simultaneously and believing he could control the current of each. Lucien's people moved on it within the hour. Kaelyn was not there for that. She was back at the penthouse, a different one, a secondary location she hadn't known existed, 3 floors in a building on the opposite side of the harbor, with Petra and one other person and the specific knowledge that things were happening in the dark of the city that she had no visibility into. She sat at the window and looked at the harbor and thought about Callum's face during the interrogation. The fatigue in it. The particular exhaustion of a person who'd been managing a double weight for so long that they'd lost the memory of what it felt like to carry only one thing. She thought about Derek, his face in the early months, before she understood what the flatness in his eyes meant, the way she'd looked at him across the architecture of her own misreading and seen something that wasn't there. She thought about the gap between what people presented and what they were. She thought about Lucien, the man who'd sat outside her door at night so she could sleep, who'd built her safety out of violence and infrastructure and the particular kind of ferocious, quiet attention he paid to things that mattered to him. She thought about what it cost to be something like him in a world like this one. Her phone rang at 2:15 in the morning. Lucien's voice was different this time, flatter, post-operational. "It's done," he said. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Your people?" "Minor injuries. No casualties." She breathed out. "Ven?" she said. A pause. "Ven was not at the warehouse," Lucien said. "He moved locations sometime in the last 3 hours." Another pause, and in it she heard something shift in his voice, something careful and significant. "He has Derek with him." She was very still. "We found communication logs at the warehouse," Lucien said. "Derek has been more embedded with Ven's operation than I understood. He's not just a source. Ven has been running him as an asset, grooming him for something specific." "What specific?" Lucien was quiet for a moment. "There's footage," he said, "from before tonight, recorded on Derek's phone. His voice was very controlled. He's been documenting your movements. For months. From before you called me. He had surveillance on the diner, on your routes, on the building where you lived. A pause. He gave Ven a detailed profile. Everything about you. Every vulnerability. Every pattern. The room felt very cold. He built a target profile, she said. Yes. On me. On you. A beat. Because he understood before either of us did what you would eventually mean to me, and he sold that information to someone who wanted to use it. She put her hand over her mouth. Kaelyn. She took her hand away. He knew, she said. He knew about the Velvet Room. He knew about you. That whole time he was with me. Her voice stopped working properly. She made it work anyway. He targeted me because of you. It appears that way, Lucien said quietly. She sat with that for a moment. The full architectural weight of it. Not just the 14 months of what Derek had done to her. Not just the bruises and the fear and the careful, methodical destruction of every connection she had in the world, but the possibility that it had a structure she hadn't seen, that she had been selected, that the cruelty hadn't been random or personal or even about her, that she had been a means to an end in someone else's longer game. She didn't know yet whether that made it worse or different or just another shape of the same terrible thing. I need you to find him, she said. I'm going to find him. And Ven, I'm going to find him too. She looked at the harbor, black water, light on its surface, the city's reflection broken up by the current into something unrecognizable. When you do, she said. Then she stopped. She thought about what she actually wanted to say. She thought about all the versions of the sentence, the ones that asked for mercy, the ones that demanded it, the ones that specified the particular shape of what she needed the ending to look like. When you do, she said again, I want to be there. Lucien was quiet for a long moment. Okay, he said. She hung up and sat in the dark with the harbor light on the water and felt something complete its transformation inside her. The last remnant of the person who'd sat in the bus station bathroom and shaken, who'd pressed her palms against her thighs and tried to make the tremor stop, who'd moved through the world at minimum footprint and called herself practical when what she was afraid. She was still afraid. But the fear had changed shape. It was no longer the fear of a person waiting for something to happen to them. It was the fear of a person who had decided to be inside what happened next rather than beneath it. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the black water and waited for morning. And somewhere in Blackwater City, in a location that Lucien was already triangulating through the remnants of Ven's warehouse communication network, Derek Rayner was sitting in a room with a man who had spent 4 years building toward this specific moment. And neither of them knew yet that the woman they'd spent 4 years using as a piece on someone else's board had just... Morning came in gray and hard, the kind of dawn that didn't so much arrive as it simply replaced the dark with something marginally less absolute. Kaelyn had not slept. She'd sat at the window of the secondary penthouse and watched the harbor change color from black to gray to the particular flat silver of a winter morning with no sun behind it, and she'd thought about Derek. Not the Derek of the early months, the charming surface of him, but the Derek underneath that surface, the one she'd glimpsed in fragments before she understood what she was looking at. The Derek who stood at the foot of her bed in the dark watching her sleep. The Derek who'd spent months before she ever met him collecting intelligence on a woman he'd selected from a distance like a hunter selecting terrain. She thought about that, the coldness of it, the calculation. She'd thought what happened to her was personal. She'd thought it was random. She'd thought in her worst moments that something in her had drawn it, some quality of vulnerability that men like Derek could smell, some failure of discernment, some deficiency she could have corrected if she'd been paying better attention. It was none of those things. She'd been chosen, for what she represented, for who she might eventually call. She sat with that knowledge and felt it settle into her like ballast, heavy, ugly, but stabilizing in a way she hadn't expected. Because if she'd been chosen deliberately, then what happened to her wasn't the result of some essential flaw in her. It was the result of someone else's plan, and someone else's plans could be answered. Lucien arrived at 6:40 with 2 people she didn't recognize and the look of a man who'd been awake all night making decisions. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her. You didn't sleep, he said. Neither did you. He came in and sat across from her and put a tablet on the table between them. On the screen was a map of the Southern Harbor District, industrial zone, warehouses, the specific geography of the part of the city that existed to move things without being watched. We found Ven, he said. Her chest tightened. He relocated to a facility on the South Basin, private industrial property registered to a shell company. We traced it through a chain of 3 holding entities that Callum's communication logs gave us the thread to follow. He touched the screen. A warehouse complex near the waterline, gray buildings, a private access road. He's been there since before midnight. He has 6 of his senior operational people with him and a larger contingent of contracted security. And Derek, she said. Derek is there. She looked at the map. How do you know? Because Derek called someone from inside the facility at 3 a.m. His burner phone. He called a woman named Sandra Kress who used to run product distribution for his operation at Pier 17. He told her to liquidate his assets and wire the money to an account in a city he didn't name. Lucien paused. People who plan to come back don't liquidate their assets. She understood what that meant. He's leaving with Ven, she said. He's leaving with Ven when Ven decides the Blackwater operation is resolved, which means they're not done yet. She looked at him. What do they still need? Lucien held her gaze. They need me to come to them. She looked at the map again. The warehouse. The water. The 6 people and the contracted security, and Derek somewhere inside all of it, in a room in a building on the edge of the harbor, waiting to see if the trap he'd been building for 4 years was going to close. They don't know you found the warehouse, she said. No. They think you're still trying to locate Ven. Yes. She sat with the geometry of it. You're going to go in, she said. Yes. You're going to use the fact that they're not expecting you to. Yes. She looked at him. I'm going with you. He looked at her for a long moment. Kaelyn, you said okay, she said. Last night on the phone. I said I wanted to be there, and you said okay. That was before I had the full picture of what Ven has inside that building. I don't care what he has inside the building. I do. His voice was flat and quiet, and absolutely non-negotiable in the specific way of a man who had looked at a set of facts and arrived at a conclusion that fear was trying to move and wouldn't be moved. I care significantly about what he has inside the building. She leaned forward. Derek has spent 4 years making me a piece on his board, she said. He took my life apart so he could use me. He sat across from me for 14 months and looked at my face, and the whole time, her voice compressed. She let it. I need to be there when it ends. I need to see it with my own eyes, or it will never be real to me. Do you understand that? He looked at her. She could see the calculation running behind his eyes. Not cold, not detached, but the real and complicated arithmetic of a person weighing what was true against what was safe. The specific calculus of someone who had spent years protecting things by keeping them distant and was now confronting the limits of distance as a strategy. You stay with me, he said. You don't move independently. You don't approach Derek under any circumstances. Okay. If I tell you to get down, you get down immediately. Okay. If I tell you to go back, I'll argue about it, she said, honestly, but I'll hear the argument first. Something moved through his face, not quite a smile, something adjacent. Okay, he said. They moved at dusk. The approach to the South Basin facility required crossing 3 blocks of open industrial ground with limited cover, then a perimeter fence, then a secondary barrier. Lucien Vale's team, 8 people, not counting Kaelyn, selected from the personnel he still trusted implicitly after the reconstruction of his network that had happened in the previous 12 hours, moved through the approach in 2-person units with the practiced silence of people who'd done this kind of work in similar geography before. Kaelyn moved with Lucien. She wore dark clothing Petra had sourced, boots with good grip, nothing that caught light. She'd tied her hair back and she moved low, and she breathed through her nose the way she'd learned to breathe in the months of hiding, controlled, quiet, drawing air without announcing it. The rain had started again around 5. Light, persistent, the kind that got into everything and made every surface slick. It was cold enough that her breath fogged slightly when she exhaled. She focused on Lucien's back 6 feet ahead of her, and she moved when he moved and stopped when he stopped. They took the perimeter fence at a point where the security camera coverage had a 90-second gap. She didn't ask how he knew about the gap. She understood he knew about it the way he knew about most structural vulnerabilities in the city's criminal infrastructure, through years of patient intelligence gathering that happened whether or not it was immediately relevant. The fence was chain link, and they went over it without wire cutters, which told her something about the physical condition of the people around her. She went over it and landed in the mud on the other side, and her ribs sent a bright white protest through her left side, and she breathed through it without sound. Lucien was watching her. She nodded once. "I'm fine." He turned and moved toward the secondary barrier, gate. The warehouse complex was 3 connected buildings arranged in a rough U-shape around a central loading area. The middle building, the largest, was where the heat signatures were concentrated, according to the reconnaissance that had been running since 4 in the morning using equipment she hadn't asked the provenance of. 6 thermal signatures in the upper level, a larger grouping, 9, 10, on the ground floor. The contracted security was distributed around the perimeter and at the 2 main entrance points. Lucien's team took the perimeter security in coordinated silence over a 4-minute window. She didn't see most of it. She was in position against the eastern wall of the middle building with Lucien, listening to the faint sounds of things resolving in the dark around them. But she heard enough to understand the general shape of it. Then they were inside. The ground floor of the middle warehouse was storage, pallets, equipment, the smell of machine oil and salt water that the harbor district had in the bones of every building. The light was low, coming from industrial fixtures mounted high on the structural beams, casting more shadow than illumination. She moved close behind Lucien and watched the angles and felt her heart doing something loud and specific in the cavity of her chest. They'd gotten through 4 of Ven's ground floor people when the 5th one saw them. The shot went wide, adrenaline and surprise making the aim bad. And then Lucien's team responded, and then the building stopped being quiet. What followed was not the choreographed violence of a film. It was loud and disorienting and happened in several places simultaneously, and Kaelyn pressed herself against a concrete pillar and watched the angles and kept her head down and focused on maintaining awareness of where Lucien was in the chaos, his dark coat, his movement, the specific economy of how he operated in this context. She'd known he was capable of this. She hadn't seen it directly before. She saw it now. He moved through the industrial space with the contained efficiency of something that had made peace with what it was. Not reckless, not performative, precise. Every movement served a function. She watched him cover ground, direct 2 of his people with hand signals, and make decisions at a speed that left no visible gap between assessment and action. And she felt the complicated reality of who he was settle over her like cold water, not washing anything away, just clarifying the texture of it. 4 minutes. Then the ground floor was held. 2 of Lucien's people had injuries, but neither serious, one to the shoulder, one a broken hand from a struggle she'd partially witnessed. She heard one of them report it and heard Lucien's brief acknowledgement and saw them keep moving because there was still the upper level. The staircase to the upper floor was steel, open-sided, running along the north interior wall. 8 people went up it in 2 groups. Lucien went with the first group. Kaelyn went 3 steps behind him. At the top of the stairs there was a mezzanine level, offices converted from original storage space, plywood and steel framing, a long corridor with doors on both sides. At the far end of the corridor, a light was on behind a closed door. One of Lucien's people checked the first 3 doors. Empty. The 4th door opened from the inside before anyone touched it. The man who stepped out was large and gray-haired and had a tattoo on his neck, a circle with something inside it distorted by the angle in the light. And he had a gun up before the door had fully swung open, and there were 3 tense seconds during which everyone in the corridor was making calculations, and the air had the specific density of a situation that was one wrong movement from becoming irreversible. Then Lucien said, "Put it down, Marsh." The gray-haired man, Marsh, one of Ven's senior operational people, She understood this was the man Tessa had seen at her building. Looked at Lucien with an expression of pure professional assessment. He looked at the corridor. He looked at the number of people in it. He put the gun down. "Where is he?" Lucien said. Marsh looked at the closed door at the end of the corridor. She heard Derek's voice before the door opened. He was talking to someone inside the room. Rapid, with the frantic quality of a person in whom the plan had recently stopped feeling reliable, the specific pitch of someone who'd been certain of something and was becoming less certain with every passing minute and was compensating by talking faster. She couldn't make out the words through the door. She didn't need to. She knew that voice. She'd heard it at every frequency. Charming, cold, frightened, explosive. She'd heard it in the dark, and she'd heard it 2 inches from her face, and she'd heard it in the moments before things went bad and the moments after. She knew every register of it. She stood behind Lucien in the corridor and breathed and kept her hands still. Lucien opened the door. The room was large. It had been a manager's office at some point, expanded or converted, with the harbor visible through a wall of dirty windows on the far side. The lights were overhead fluorescents, 2 of them buzzing with the specific frequency that lived behind the eyes. There was a table, chairs, equipment she identified as communication and surveillance hardware. 2 men she didn't recognize stood at positions around the room. They read the situation at the door with the rapid adjustments of professionals and made the correct assessment of the odds. At the table behind a laptop sat Kostas Ven. He was smaller than she'd expected. That was always the thing about men like him. The image constructed by their reputation produced a physical expectation that the actual person rarely matched. He was perhaps 60, with the compact density of someone who'd survived decades in dangerous environments by being more careful than everyone around him. Gray stubble, eyes that were small and dark, and completely calm. He looked at Lucien entering the room with the expression of a man who'd considered this possibility and had not quite expected it to arrive this soon. He looked at Kaelyn. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes moved, a rapid recalibration, and she understood that he was filing the fact of her presence, reassessing the available moves. "Lucien," he said. His voice was unaccented, neutral, the voice of a man who'd spent years making himself legible to the widest possible range of people. "You're early. Your perimeter was optimistic," Lucien said. Ven looked at the 2 men in the room. They moved to the wall without needing to be told, hands visible, the pragmatic acknowledgement of odds that had shifted. "Sit down," Lucien said. Ven sat. Lucien looked at the far side of the room. A door. Interior. Connecting to an adjacent space. He looked at one of his people and made a small gesture. The man went to the door and opened it. Derek was on the other side. He came through the doorway with the look of someone who'd been listening through the door and had been caught listening. A frozen half-second of exposure before his expression reorganized itself into something he thought looked like composure. It didn't look like composure. It looked like a man in a burning building deciding to button his jacket. He looked at Lucien. He looked at Kaelyn. Something happened in his face. It was not guilt. She'd long since stopped expecting guilt from Derek, had understood that the architecture of his psychology didn't include the structural element that produced genuine guilt, the way some buildings were constructed without load-bearing walls and held together through other means. What happened in his face was something more primitive than guilt. It was the look of a predator who had been hunting and has just discovered that the thing it was hunting had turned around. Fear, clean, undisguised, for exactly 2 seconds before he buried it. She held his gaze. She didn't look away. His eyes moved off hers first. "Derek," Lucien said. Derek looked at him. "Sit down." Derek sat at the table across from Ven, and his hands were shaking. Not the fine, persistent tremor she knew from herself, but the visible shake of someone operating on adrenaline and cocaine and 14 months of a plan that was disintegrating in real time. He pressed his hands flat on the table, and they still shook. Lucien stood at the head of the table. The room was very quiet. "Tell me how it started," Lucien said. To Derek, not to Ven. To Derek specifically, which was a choice she understood. Derek was the accessible point, the less controlled one, the one whose composure had already failed. Derek looked at Ven. Ven looked at the table. Don't look at him, Lucien said. He can't help you right now. Tell me how it started. Derek's jaw moved. He was doing the internal calculation on what to say, what not to say, what version of events served him best. And she could see the calculation happening because she knew his face better than she'd ever wanted to, and she could see the gears of it. I knew about you, Derek said. His voice was tight. Before Kaelyn, I knew who you were, what you had. He stopped. Ven approached me. 2 years before before anything, he said there was an opportunity. He said you had a vulnerability, and he needed someone on the ground level to help identify and develop it. And the vulnerability was what? Lucien said. Derek looked at Kaelyn. She held his gaze. He said you'd been seen with her, Derek said. At the Velvet Room, before she left. He said she was someone you'd... He stopped. He said she mattered to you. In a way people around you didn't usually matter. The room was absolutely silent. So you found her, Lucien said. I found her. It took 8 months. Derek said it with a flat, dead quality, as if the confession had evacuated something. I got a job at a place she ate lunch at twice a week. I made it look... He stopped. I made it look natural. Kaelyn heard those words enter the room, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not surprised, she'd had hours to prepare for the shape of this truth, but the specific gravity of having the thing confirmed in his own voice, in his own words, in a room where he could not take it back. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She kept her hands at her sides, and she kept her face neutral, and she held that information inside herself and let it settle where it needed to settle. Derek looked at her. Kaelyn, don't, Lucien said quietly. Derek closed his mouth. Ven had been watching the exchange with the precise patience of a man who was still running calculations even now, even in this room with these odds, because men like Ven didn't stop running calculations until they were physically incapable of it. She could see him measuring angles, the door, the people in the room, what leverage remained, what was still tradable. He looked at Lucien. You've dismantled most of my Blackwater operation in the last 6 hours, he said. The warehouse. My people here. Callum's gone. He said it without emotion, a balance sheet being read aloud. You've cost me significantly. Yes, Lucien said. What I've cost you over the last 14 months. The route changes, the personnel adjustments, the operational disruption from Callum's access. That's recoverable. You'll rebuild within 6 months, he paused. We're roughly even on damage. We're not, Lucien said. Ven looked at him. You put someone I care about in the way of someone capable of this. He didn't gesture toward Derek. He didn't need to. You built a 4-year operation around hurting her specifically because it would affect me. That's not damage I put a number on. Ven's expression stayed neutral, but the calculation behind his eyes ran very fast. I can give you something worth more than retribution, he said. Lucien said nothing. The federal task force that's been building a case on your harbor operation for the last 2 years. I have a source inside it. I know what they have, what they're missing, how far out they are. He paused. That's worth more than this. Lucien looked at him for a long moment. Yes, he said. It is. Ven's expression shifted, fractionally, toward relief, the loosening of someone who's found the edge of a surface they can stand on. But I'll get it another way, Lucien said. The relief disappeared. Derek's hand shook harder. Get them up, Lucien said to his people, to Ven and Derek both. We're moving locations. Derek stood. His chair scraped back and he stood and his eyes were moving again. The rapid inventory of exits, angles, options. And she recognized the look. She'd seen it in the apartment in the seconds before things went bad. The specific energy of a man whose plan had failed and who was substituting escalation for strategy. She saw it a half second before it happened. He moved toward the window, not toward an exit, but toward the equipment on the table, one hand sweeping out and grabbing the laptop and swinging it hard toward the nearest of Lucien's people, making space, making chaos, the desperate improvisation of someone with nothing left to lose. And then he had a gun. She didn't see where it came from. concealed ankle or waistband missed in whatever search had happened. And then he had it up and he was backing toward the window and his hand was shaking so badly the gun was describing small circles in the air and his eyes were everywhere and nowhere. And he was saying something that she couldn't parse because all her processing was going to the gun and to the calculation of bodies in the room and angles and what was between her and him and what was between him and Lucien. Lucien had gone very still. Derek, his voice was the quiet below anger register. You have one move left. Make it a good one. Shut up! Derek's voice had gone high and thin. Shut up! You think you can just come in here and… He stopped. He swung the gun toward Kaelyn. Back up. Everyone back up. Nobody moved. Back up or I… You won't, she said. Every head in the room turned to her. She hadn't planned to speak. She was speaking. Derek looked at her. The gun was pointed at her and his hand was shaking and his face was the face she'd spent 14 months learning the geography of every expression, every micro-movement, every tell. And she knew his face the way you knew something you wished you'd never had reason to study. You won't, she said again. Her voice came out level. She didn't entirely understand how. Because if you do, you lose the only thing keeping you alive in this room. Put the gun down, Derek. He stared at her. You chose me because I was supposed to be a tool, she said. And I was, for a long time. But you're looking at the room right now, and you're understanding that it didn't work the way you planned. She took one step toward him. Put it down. Kaelyn. Lucien's voice, low, warning. She took another step. Derek's hand was shaking violently now, the gun moving in arcs that told her more about his state than his face did. His eyes had the quality she remembered from the worst nights. The white-edged look of a man past the point where calculation was available to him, operating purely on the adrenaline of cornered desperation. You destroyed my life, she said. She kept walking. Slow. One step. Not because I did anything to you, not because I was anything to you, because I was useful. Another step. She was 10 feet from him. And now you're here with a gun that you might or might not use, and outside this building there are police sirens that have been getting louder for the last 4 minutes, which means whoever called them is about to make every exit from this building complicated. She was right about the sirens. She'd been tracking the sound since the shooting on the ground floor, and she'd been doing the math on response times. Derek's eyes moved toward the window. She took the last 3 steps in a rush and got both hands on the gun. What happened next was not graceful. It was the ugly, close-quarters struggle of 2 people fighting over a weapon in a small room, his greater size and her desperation roughly canceling each other out, her hands locked on the barrel and his on the grip, her shoulder screaming where the fracture was, and the gun going off once into the ceiling with a sound like a thunderclap inside the room, and plaster raining down. And then Lucien was there. He got between them. He put one hand on Derek's wrist, the gun wrist, the precise grip of someone who knew exactly where the structural weak point of a wrist was. And Derek made a sound that was more animal than human, and the gun fell. Lucien caught it before it hit the floor. He stepped back. Derek was on his knees. He was holding his wrist to his chest, and he was looking at the floor, and he was breathing in the fast, shallow way of someone whose body was processing the end of something and didn't know yet what to do with the space where the plan had been. Kaelyn stood 3 feet away and breathed. The room smelled of cordite and sweat and rain from the open window and the cold harbor air coming through it. Lucien looked at her. She met his gaze. Your shoulder, he said. I know, she said. He held her gaze for one more second. Something in his face was doing the complicated thing again. The underneath thing she couldn't fully name. And then the sound of boots on the stairs reached them all, and the sirens outside were very close now, and the moment, whatever it was, compressed and was contained and put away. Lucien handed the gun to one of his people. He looked at Derek on the floor. He made a decision. Police are 30 seconds out, he said to the room. Nobody leaves this building. Derek's head came up. His face went through several things rapidly. Disbelief. Calculation. Fear. He stared at Lucien. You're going to let them… I'm going to let the law decide what happens to you, Lucien said. Quiet. Absolute. which is not what you expected from me. Derek looked at Kaelyn. She looked back at him. She didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. The door at the end of the corridor hit the wall, and the first officer came through it with a weapon up and a flashlight sweeping the space, and behind him more footsteps and more lights, and the radio noise of law enforcement filling a building, and Kaelyn stood in the middle of the room with plaster dust in her hair and blood on her hands from where the gun barrel had cut her palm, and the sound of her own heartbeat very loud in her own ears, and watched Derek Rayner put his hands above his head in the wash of police lights, and she felt the thing that had been building in her chest for 14 months. The fear, the specific architecture of dread that had become so familiar she'd started to mistake it for her own personality. Begin, very slowly, the thing that had been building in her chest for 14 months began, very slowly, to break. Not the way she'd feared it would break. Not the collapse of something structural, not the failure of load-bearing walls. More like the specific release of pressure in a vessel that had been sealed too long. The slow equalization of something that had been held against its nature. She stood in the wash of police lights with plaster dust in her hair and blood on her palm, and she breathed, and the breathing was different from all the breathing that had come before it. Different from the controlled nasal breathing of hiding, different from the compressed chest breathing of fear. It was just breathing. Air moving in and out of a body that was still standing. Derek was on his knees with his hands behind his head, and two officers moving toward him, and he was looking at the floor, and she understood that he would not look at her again. Not tonight. Maybe not ever, if the geometry of the next several years arranged itself the way it was arranging itself in her mind. Lucien stood beside her. Not touching, just beside. One of the officers, a sergeant by his chevrons, broad-shouldered, with the particular quality of a man who'd walked into complicated rooms before and knew how to read them, moved through the space and looked at Lucien with an expression that was not quite recognition and not quite deference, but something in between. He looked at the room. He looked at the people. He looked at Ven, who was sitting at the table with his hands visible and his expression back to neutral, the composure reasserting itself with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd been arrested before and understood that composure was the only asset that survived processing. The sergeant looked at Lucien again. "Mr. Vale," he said. "Sergeant," Lucien said. A pause during which a significant amount of information was exchanged without words. "We'll need statements," the sergeant said. "Of course," Lucien said. The sergeant looked at Kaelyn. His eyes moved to her hand, the cut palm, the blood, the way she was holding it slightly away from her body. "Ma'am, are you injured?" "I'm fine," she said. He looked at her with the flat, careful expression she recognized from Nurse Reeves in the emergency room. The look of a person who'd heard that sentence before and understood its actual meaning. "We have a medic downstairs," he said. She looked at her hand. The cut was deep enough to need attention, but not deep enough to be immediately serious. She'd been ignoring it because there were other things to track. "Okay," she said. "Thank you." The medic's name was Torres. She was young, efficient, and had the quality of someone who did her work without requiring conversation, which Kaelyn appreciated. She cleaned the palm, assessed the depth, applied closure strips, and wrapped it without asking how it happened or making the particular face that people made when they wanted to comment on something and were exercising the restraint not to. "Ribs?" Torres said, not looking up from the hand. Kaelyn looked at her. "What?" "The way you're holding your left side." She tied off the bandage. "You've been compensating since I started working on you." "Possible hairline fracture?" Kaelyn said. "Pre-existing." Torres looked up. She looked at Kaelyn's face and then at her hand and then back at her face with the comprehensive assessment of someone who'd been trained to read bodies rather than words. "You should get imaging," she said. "I know." "Tonight if possible." "I know." Torres held her gaze for a moment. Something in her expression softened fractionally. Not pity. Kaelyn had learned to distinguish pity from something more useful, and this was more useful. "You did good tonight," she said quietly. "Whatever happened in there?" Kaelyn looked at the wrapped hand. She thought about the gun and the plaster dust and Derek on his knees. "I don't know yet," she said. Torres nodded like that was an acceptable answer and stood up and moved to her next patient. The processing took 4 hours. She gave her statement in a room at the South Basin facility that the police had converted into a temporary interview space. A folding table, 2 chairs, a detective named Rios who had dark circles under her eyes, and a recorder on the table and the focused patience of someone working a case that was more complicated than her initial briefing had prepared her for. Kaelyn told her everything, not the everything of Lucien's operation. She didn't have the full architecture of that, and what she had, she understood, was not hers to narrate, but the everything of Derek, the 14 months, the bruises and the hospitals, and the 3 police reports she'd never filed, and the bus station bathroom and the call she'd made, the warehouse, the gun. What he'd told her in that room about finding her deliberately, about the 4 years of construction that had preceded the 14 months she'd experienced as random cruelty. Detective Rios listened without interrupting. She made notes. Her face moved through several things, carefully managed professional neutrality over something that wanted to be something else. And at the end, she looked at Kaelyn across the folding table and said, "We're going to need you to be available for the prosecution." "I'll be available," Kaelyn said. "It may take time. Cases like this? Detective." Kaelyn looked at her. "I've been waiting for something to be over for 14 months. I can wait for the right ending." Rios looked at her for a moment. Then she clicked off the recorder and said, "Off the record." Kaelyn waited. "What you did in that room with the gun." Rios shook her head slightly. "Don't do that again." "I know. That kind of thing ends differently 9 times out of 10. I know that too." Rios looked at her. "But you're the 10th. It wasn't said admiringly. It was said the way you said a fact about weather, accurate, morally neutral, neither condemnation nor celebration." "Maybe," Kaelyn said. She walked out of the interview room and found Lucien waiting in the corridor. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his coat gone. Somewhere in the preceding hours he'd lost the coat, and without it he looked different in a way she couldn't immediately name, less architectural, more present. He looked at her when she came out. She looked at the bandage on her hand and then at him. "How bad is it?" she asked. He understood she wasn't asking about the hand. "Ven will cooperate with the federal case in exchange for sentencing considerations. That's being negotiated now." He paused. "The cooperation will include information about the task force investigation, which resolves a significant problem for me in a way that costs Ven everything he spent years building and costs me—" He stopped. "What?" she said. "Several operations that were profitable but exposed. I'll dismantle them voluntarily as part of an informal arrangement with certain interested parties." He said it without emotion, the way he said things that had already been decided and were no longer worth spending feeling on. "It makes me smaller, more careful, harder to see." She looked at him. "Is that survivable for you? Organizationally?" "Yes." "Is it—" She thought about how to ask what she actually wanted to ask. "Is it what you want?" He looked at the wall for a moment. Something moved through his face. "What I want," he said, "is complicated." She held his gaze. He looked at her, really looked at her. Not the inventory look, not the assessment, but the underneath look. The one she'd caught in fragments across the last week and never quite been able to see in full because he'd always managed to contain it before it completed itself. He wasn't containing it now. "I want to not be the reason you're in danger," he said. "I want what happened tonight to have been the last time you're in danger because of what I am." He paused. "And I want things that are more complicated than that I'm not going to say in a corridor outside a police interview at 4 in the morning." She looked at him for a long moment. "Okay," she said. "Okay, which part?" "All of it," she said. "For now." He pushed off the wall and they walked out of the building together into the cold pre-dawn air, and the harbor was gray and still, and somewhere behind them Derek Rayner was in the back of a police vehicle heading toward a different kind of future than the one he'd spent 4 years engineering. 6 weeks passed. She didn't move back into the main penthouse. She found an apartment on the north side of the city, small, 4th floor, a window that faced east so the morning light came in first thing. She furnished it herself, over 2 weekends, with the specific pleasure of choosing each object without anyone else's preference to navigate. A couch in a green she liked. A kitchen table with 4 chairs, even though she had no one to invite yet. A bookshelf she filled slowly from the used bookstore 3 blocks away. She went back to work. Not the diner. That was over, that chapter was finished in more ways than one. But a catering company that worked events across the city, which gave her irregular hours and different environments, and the sustained practical focus of feeding large numbers of people on a deadline, which it turned out she was good at in a way she found grounding. She went to therapy. A woman named Dr. Cahill, office on the 7th floor of a building downtown, a palm plant and a good chair and the kind of listening that cost money and was worth every cent of it. She went every Thursday. She talked about the 14 months. She talked about the hospitals and the false reports and the bus station bathroom. She talked about being chosen, that specific word, that specific wound, and what it meant to have the architecture of something she'd experienced as personal revealed as instrumental. Dr. Cahill did not tell her how to feel about it. She asked good questions and then waited for the answers with an attention that felt like respect. Kaelyn came to understand, in the slow way that understanding actually happened rather than the sudden revelation way it happened in stories, that what Derek had done to her was 2 things simultaneously, something that had a structure outside of her, a design she hadn't authored, a plan she'd been fitted into without consent, and also something that had happened to her specifically, in her specific body, in her specific life, and that both of those things could be true at the same time without canceling each other out. She told Dr. Cahill that on a Thursday afternoon in the 7th week, Dr. Cahill said, "Yes, just that, just yes." Kaelyn sat in the good chair and looked at the palm plant and felt something settle. She saw Lucien twice during those 6 weeks. The first time was 12 days after the warehouse. He came to the apartment. She'd given him the address, a decision she'd made without examining too closely, and stood in her small living room with the new green couch and the half-filled bookshelf and looked around with an expression she couldn't categorize. "You picked green," he said. "I like green," she said. He looked at the couch for another moment. "It's good," he said, which was not a sentence she'd ever heard him use as a pure aesthetic judgment before, and something about the simplicity of it made her chest feel strange. She made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table. She'd bought 4 chairs, and it turned out having another person sit in one of them was what they were for. And she told him about the apartment and the catering job and the therapy. He listened without interrupting. "And the case?" she asked. "Derek's been charged with 12 counts, including domestic violence, conspiracy, weapons charges, and accessory to the attack on the convoy." He said it factually. His cooperation with Venn is documented in the communication logs from the warehouse. The prosecution is describing it as premeditated over a 4-year period. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "His lawyer is going to try for a diminished capacity argument," Lucien said. "Rios thinks it won't hold." "Good," she said. He looked at her. "Is it strange," he said, "that I handled things the way I did? That he's in the system instead of—" He stopped. She looked at him. "Instead of the other thing." "Yes." She thought about it honestly. She thought about the moment in the warehouse when Lucien had the gun and Derek was on his knees. She thought about what she'd expected to happen and what happened instead. "No," she said. "It's not strange. It's—" She held the cup. "I needed it to be real. A trial, a record, something that exists in the world and can be pointed to. If it disappeared—" She stopped. "I would have spent the rest of my life not quite believing it was over." He looked at her with the full attention. "That's why you did it that way," she said. "Isn't it? Not just for me. Because you understood what the ending needed to look like." He was quiet for a moment. "I've made a lot of things disappear," he said, "over the years. Because it was cleaner. Because it was faster." He looked at his coffee. "I understand the difference between what's efficient and what's right better than people in my position usually do. I don't always act on that understanding." A pause. "I wanted to this time." She looked at him across the small kitchen table with the morning light coming in the east window and felt the weight of what they both were, what they'd been and what they'd survived and what they were still in the process of becoming, settle between them not as an obstacle but as a shared terrain. "Come back Thursday," she said. "I'll cook. Real food, not Petra's." He looked at her. "You can tell me the things you didn't say in the corridor," she said, "when you're ready." Something moved through his face, slow, deliberate, the careful emergence of something that had been kept in deep containment for a long time. "Thursday," he said. The second time was Thursday. She cooked pasta, which she was good at, and opened a bottle of wine she'd bought for $12 because she didn't know wine, and $12 felt like the honest amount to spend. He brought nothing except himself, which she'd told him to, and he arrived at 7 and left at 11, and somewhere in the middle of those 4 hours, the things he hadn't said in the corridor got said at the kitchen table in the ordinary light. Not all of them. Not in one evening. Some things required the structure of time, the scaffolding of repeated presence, the gradual weight-bearing that trust built on honesty could support. But enough of them. She told him about the 4th month, the month she'd run out of the immediate kind of tears. She told him what it had felt like to understand she was trapped, and to look at the architecture of the trap, and know she'd helped build parts of it without understanding what she was building. She told him about the packed duffel bag behind the water heater and the 3 ibuprofen she'd been saving and the photograph she couldn't throw away. He listened. He didn't fill the silences with reassurance. He sat across from her and was present in the silences in the way she'd come to understand was the particular quality of his attention, the full weight of it, without performance. She asked him about Callum. He was quiet for a moment. "He's alive," he said. "He's gone. I gave him the clean exit Ven promised him, with conditions. He doesn't come back to Blackwater. He doesn't contact anyone from the organization." He looked at the wine glass. "I thought about it for a long time. What the right thing was. What decided it." He looked at her. "You asked me what handle it meant. In the hospital corridor that first night, and then again outside the office when I said it about Callum." He paused. "You kept asking me to say the specific thing, not to hide it in language. A beat. I don't have a lot of people in my life who do that." She held his gaze. "I decided that the version of myself who could still hear that question deserved to give an answer he could live with," he said. "Callum was operational to me for a long time, and then he wasn't, and there are things I've done in my life that don't have clean answers." He stopped. "This one could, so I let it." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's the most honest thing I've ever heard you say," she said. "I'm working on it," he said. She refilled his wine. "Mcheb." Winter came properly in the 2nd month. Snow, which was unusual for Blackwater, arriving in the first week of December in a way the city wasn't entirely equipped for. Streets going quiet under it. The harbor turning a particular muffled gray. The neon of the waterfront district reflecting off white surfaces and making the city look almost soft. Kaelyn stood on her apartment rooftop. Her building had one, accessible through a hatch the super had given her a key to after she'd helped him carry groceries up 3 flights, and watched it snow. She was wearing Lucien's coat, which he'd left 2 Thursdays ago and not asked back for, and she had her hands in the pockets and her face turned up slightly to the falling white. She thought about Tessa, who'd been offered a settlement by Derek's defense and had declined it on principle, who was back at the diner and had sent Kaelyn a text last week that said, simply, "You okay?" And to which Kaelyn had replied yes and meant it. She thought about Detective Hale, who'd left a business card on a hospital table and asked nothing in return for it. She'd sent him a note after the warehouse, not a call, but a written note, because some things deserve the weight of paper. She'd said thank you. She'd said it was the card that made her understand that someone else could see what she'd stopped being able to see herself. She thought about the trial, which was 3 months away, and what she would say when she sat in a chair and told the truth about 14 months in front of a room full of people. She wasn't afraid of it. That surprised her. She'd expected to be afraid of it. She'd spent weeks anticipating the fear and planning for it, building the scaffolding of preparation around a dread that, when she actually looked for it, was smaller than she'd expected. Not gone. She was honest enough with herself to know it would arrive on the actual day in ways she couldn't fully anticipate, but manageable. Something she could walk toward. She heard the hatch open behind her. Lucien came up through it and crossed the roof and stood beside her and looked at the snow. She'd given him a key to the building. Not the apartment, the building. In the same way she'd given him the address without examining it too closely. "You're going to freeze," he said. "I'm wearing your coat," she said. He looked at the coat. He didn't ask for it back. They stood in the snow and looked at the city. Blackwater spread below them in all its complicated geography. The harbor district, the industrial south, the neon waterfront, the old buildings and new ones, the streets that ran clean and the streets that ran dirty, and all the layered history of a city that had been surviving itself for longer than either of them had been alive. It was a dangerous city. It would continue to be a dangerous city. The trial would happen, and the verdict would be what it was, and Ven's organization would rebuild under different management, and Lucien would navigate the federal case and come out the other side of it altered but intact, and the city would keep moving through all of it with the magnificent indifference of places that have seen too much to be surprised by any of it. She knew all of that. She also knew this. The tremor was gone. Not suppressed, not managed, not held down by the weight of control she'd been exerting on it for months. Gone. She'd noticed it 2 weeks ago, standing in the catering kitchen at 6 in the morning with her hands in warm water. And she'd stood still for a long time, just feeling the stillness of her own hands and understanding that the architectural fact she'd been waiting for had arrived without announcement, the way healing usually did. She felt it now. Her hands in Lucien's coat pockets, completely still. Just hands. "Tell me something," she said. He looked at her. "What do you actually want?" she said. "Not what's complicated. The simple version, if there is one." He was quiet for a moment. Snow fell between them and on the city around them. "This," he said. She looked at him. "This specific thing," he said. "Right now, standing here." He looked at the city and then back at her. "I've spent 20 years building things that were designed to not need me personally present for them to function. Organizations, infrastructure, systems." He paused. "I've been good at it. And I've been not here, not in the way that—" He stopped. She waited. "You make me want to be here," he said, simply, without architecture around it, without the careful layering that usually cushioned his sentences. "That's the simple version." She looked at him in the snow with the city behind him and felt something in her chest complete a movement that had been in process for a long time. She didn't say, "I love you." That was a sentence that required more weight-bearing than 6 weeks could provide, and she was done with moving faster than the structural integrity of things could support. She took her hand out of his coat pocket and put it in his. His fingers closed around hers. They stood like that for a while, not speaking. The snow covering the city in its temporary and forgiving white, smoothing the edges of things, making the familiar strange and the hard soft. Below them, Blackwater went on being itself. Somewhere in it, Derek Rayner sat in a holding facility and waited for a trial date. Somewhere in it, the pieces of Ven's operation were being inventoried by federal agents who were beginning to understand the full scope of what they'd dismantled. Somewhere in it, Callum was in a city whose name Kaelyn didn't know, beginning whatever came next. Somewhere in it, Tessa was closing up the diner, and Nurse Reeves was starting her overnight shift, and Detective Hale was probably working a case that hadn't gotten to its ending yet. The city full of unfinished things, full of people in the middle of their stories, full of the ongoing complicated work of surviving and accounting for it, and going forward anyway. Kaelyn stood on her rooftop in the snow, with Lucien's hand in hers, and her face turned toward the cold air, and she breathed in the particular smell of a winter city, salt and exhaust, and something clean underneath it all, something that the snow carried down from somewhere higher and further than any of them could see. She thought about the duffel bag behind the water heater, $240 and a birth certificate and 3 ibuprofen she'd been saving, the photograph she couldn't throw away. She thought about who she'd been in the bus station bathroom with the tremor in her hands and the split lip and the 14 months of diminishment pressing down on her like a physical weight. She thought about who she'd been before that, the girl who'd stitched a knife wound without being asked, who'd argued about eating like it mattered, who'd treated a dangerous man like a human being because that was simply what she did. She thought about who she was now. Not recovered. Not healed in the clean, final way that words like recovered implied. Something more honest than that. More ongoing. A person who had been taken apart and had put herself back together with full knowledge of each piece, who understood the weight of things because she'd carried the wrong things for too long and had learned the difference through the specific education of consequence. A person who knew how to leave, how to call, how to fight in a dark warehouse with her shoulder screaming and her hands on a gun, how to stand in front of the man who'd built 4 years of cruelty around her and look him in the eyes and tell him to put it down. A person who could stand on a rooftop in winter and hold someone's hand and not flinch. Lucien's thumb moved across her knuckles, slow, almost absent, the movement of someone who wasn't thinking about what they were doing because they didn't need to, just present, just here. She leaned slightly into his shoulder. He adjusted his stance to accommodate it. Naturally, without comment. The snow fell on Blackwater City and covered its scars and its secrets and its beautiful, terrible ongoing life. And for the first time since the violence began, for the first time in longer than that, if she was honest, for the first time since a version of herself she'd been mourning had gone quiet enough for a new one to speak, Kaelyn Voss felt the future as something other than threat. Not promise, not guarantee. She was too clear-eyed for those words now. Just open. Just space. Just the specific freedom of a person who had survived the worst of themselves and others and come out the other side with their hands still steady and their eyes still open and the whole complicated, frightening, ordinary world still ahead of them. That was enough. For now, in the snow, with the city below and the winter above and the warmth of someone's hand in hers, it was more than enough. It was everything.